Okay, in this lecture, we're going to look at Roman civic life, and we're going to really kind of understand the interface between the imperial bureaucracy at Rome and the city councils at the local level. I like to call this, as I note right here, sort of government light, that the emperor and his staff, which never amounted to more than, say, 5,000 administrators, dispatched orders to the city councils at the local level where they were implemented at the local level. This put an enormous responsibility on the local councilors, who were mainly the local aristocrats, the landowners, the wealthier class in this way. Especially in the era of the Antonines, or the five good emperors, this interface was successfully achieved by virtue of the efforts of the emperors themselves. When we look at Trajan or Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius in particular, but Antoninus Pius as well, these emperors spent more years outside of Rome, in the provinces or on the frontiers with the army, which we'll be discussing in a later lecture, than they did in the city of Rome itself. This is a big departure from the Julio-Claudians of the past. Now we have emperors who are basically emerging from the ranks in the sense of the military establishment, or however you look at it. They know the importance of the maintenance of the connections, the infrastructure of the empire. And so they were more committed to that. And so, I mean, some were, we talked about Trajan. Hey, Nathan gave a wonderful talk about Trajan during last classes. Hadrian, not as well liked, but clearly a magnificent a genius, an architectural genius, and he implemented a number of changes. I mean, mostly good, some unfortunate. I mean, the one unfortunate thing he decided to do was to, after the sack of Jerusalem, to sort of create a Roman colony there, a Roman military colony, and try to put up a temple of Jupiter on the bases, the remains of the temple, the great temple this way. This led to the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 128 AD that just led to the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora at this point. I mean, there's always nobody's, there are no, what do I have to say? There are no saints in this process. People are making mistakes throughout. But overall, he gets remarkable credit for his journeys, his constant dealings with the military, his constant dealings with the governors and with the local council. As I note, the Antonines spent most of their reigns outside of Rome, visiting the army camps or the cities and the provinces. And this is demonstrated not by the history as much as by the countless dedications that demonstrate they were there. They were there in this town or that town, and they gave money to build an aqueduct, to build a bath, to build a gymnasium, build the infrastructure of these towns, and to sort of meet the local elite and get them to buy into the system. One of the things that they did, starting with Hadrian, they enhanced civic commitment by offering Roman citizenship to the decuriones. This is an important term. These are boards of 10 who were responsible at the local level for collecting the Roman tax. It's a burdensome task, as we'll see, but if you did it, you received Roman citizenship, at least. Overall, they reduced the size of the Roman army by relying more heavily on auxiliary troops. So they began to recruit more heavily from local populations, and the army becomes more a reflection of the provinces in which they were based, which is along the limes or the natural man-made borders that surrounded the empire and protected the empire. And it becomes less and less a reflection of the Italian population. In fact, only the Praetorian Guard now became Italian in its composition. The other thing that Hadrian started, and it really took off from there, they organized a council of jurisconsuls led by the Praetorian prefect to regularize and codify Roman law. The era of the five good emperors, is the era of the great legal scholars who began to organize and manipulate Roman law to make it more flexible, to make it more applicable generally and at the local level. So we see the great thinkers, Gaius, Opinion, Ulpian, the great legal handbooks that ultimately are going to form the Roman law code as it was codified in the reign of Justinian. And new legal forms emerge. The emperor's constitutiones, his mandata, his edicts or edict, his decrees or decreta. and his rescript, where he could either step in as commander-in-chief and impose law, or he could respond with his rescripts to questions coming into him and sort of show how the law applies to this case or that case. All of these documents, though, became fodder for a compendium of Roman law that was to some other features I'll just point out here. There, up in the upper left, you have Hadrian. He was married, but he had a boyfriend. He was a Greek from Alexandria named Antinous. They were very, very close, and then Antinous died, unfortunately. And so Hadrian was so, as a young man, Hadrian was so grief-stricken by this that he declared Antinous a god and put up his statue all over the emperor. After Hadrian, he's probably the most studied figure of the reign. He built the Pantheon. I think we have a report coming on the Pantheon, which is the image down below. He built the great temple, one of the largest temples in Rome, the Temple of Venus in Roma, which stood at the entrance to the Forum on its south side. There's the remains to the lower left and a reconstruction. Uh, but in terms of understanding the interface and how it actually worked, we have to think about and look directly at the Greek city-state, this polis institution, which again becomes municipia, becomes recognized civitas in the Roman world as well. The nexus of activity at the local level concern urban life at the polis level. And what we see in the many, many dedications is the refrain that I put up there, he boule ke ho demos, the council and the city of this, and the people of the city dedicate this or decree that, or whatever it is. This is the formula that we see again and again in all these local documents that explain what's going on at the local level. And what we see is that by this time, the elites at the local level had bought into the governmental system of the Roman Empire as expressed by the numerous dedications honoring Roman emperors that have been found. These things in all over the empire. The ones in my region in the east, especially in Cilicia, they proclaim the emperors as the Lord, each emperor as the Lord of the civilized world, or the oikumene. Oikos meaning home, estate, oikos, the dwelling, and in the passive it means the inhabited world, the place that is inhabited. According to what? According to law, according to systems, according to a polis system, according to the free trade that was going on in the Mediterranean. So the oikumene came to mean the collective of those communities or polis that viewed themselves as participating elements in the Roman world order. And at best, I mean, at the top, this was reflected by the members of the city council. And city councils, what did their activities entail? One of the things, the elite things, was to be the imperial priest of the imperial ruler cult. Increasingly, we're coming to understand that most of these cities had a special sort of precinct dedicated to the cult of the Roman emperor, the Sebastion, Sebaste meaning Augustus, but the Sebasteum usually is a little colonnaded peristyle with altars and dedications to the emperor. And it was a great way to display one's loyalty to the realm and thereby gain notice and possible advancement in the Roman hierarchy, principally through the Roman army. To worship the emperor was to demonstrate loyalty to the realm. And then in terms of local jobs, what do we see? One of the really important ones, and we'll explain why, is the gymnasiarch. So this is the counselor who managed the gymnasium, who he, at his own expense, during his year in office, he took it upon himself to cover the cost of the educational institution, which is what the gymnasium represented. The gymnasium was a place where young property holding citizens were trained to serve in the local militia. So think of it as the polis militia, formerly the city states, hoplite phalanx, and ultimately to become leaders themselves, counselors. Uh, in connection now, let's move down one, ironarchs. Ironarchs, these were sort of local sheriffs, keepers of the peace, who could marshal the local militia to suppress local violence, whether that's bandits and robbers in the hills, or maybe tribal renegades rebelling, coming down and attacking the city. The interesting thing here is that the Ironarch, and when we see their their CVs as represented, and I'm going to show you a description. The Ironarch frequently also served as a gymnasiarch, sometimes simultaneously, and therefore he simultaneously trained and commanded the local militia. So you think of all these city-states that are buying into the Roman system, each one of which is producing a kind of cadet corps. Here you have the means to recruit an auxiliary force, cohort, or whatever it might be, into the Roman army. So it starts at the grassroots, and we can see how the Roman army can incorporate upwardly mobile types from the local gentry that are willing to serve, and this is how they can suppress rebellions or renegades or bandits or whatever it might be at the local level. And from here, uh, as you begin to serve with the Roman army, then Roman status becomes achievable, whether as a ironarch, gymnasiarch, maybe you can enter into the equestrian order and become a Roman officer in the Roman army. As a auxiliary trooper, if you serve your career, you could receive Roman citizenship as part of your discharge. These are really important for understanding the kind of the way in which Rome held the peace, kept the peace at the local level this way. Another very important position was the decaprotoi, also known as in Latin as the decurione. So a decurio was a member of a board of 10, deca, who collected the Roman taxes from their community. So their job was to come up with the tax quota for the town. It frequently was the case that there was a shortfall. It was expected that the members of this board of 10 would make up the shortfall from their own resources. And again, thereby acquire status such as Hadrian offering all members of the Decuriones Roman citizenship for taking on this task. These tasks, in Greek, they were known as liturgies. These are sort of, I like to call it, conscripted philanthropy. Wealthy people would be selected, sometimes by sortition, sometimes they volunteered, to cover these civic costs of their communities. In Latin, these were called munera, instances of public philanthropy, literally gifts that were expected of newly appointed magistrates at the council. So as you step up, as you want to get a name for yourself, you would assume one of these offices and expect to spend a sizable portion of your worth. These were not cheap. This was very expensive duty this way. Typically, this was required to enter the council, but once you do, you're in the council for life. Philanthropy might include throwing expensive festivals or the town games or improvements to the local infrastructure such as baths and aqueducts, all at the magistrate's personal expense. The Greek tradition for this goes way back to the classical era, and it was known as euergetism, benefactions, good works, or philanthropy. Uh, but it was what kind of set the elite off as being elites as opposed to being commoners. Here's just some iconographic information for you. At the lower left, you are looking at the council house. This is a Hellenistic council house. It's a nice shot at Priene on the Aegean coast. And here you can see how most of these council houses are covered buildings that can seat 100 or 200 men, and they tend to be somehow auditorium, whether in a angular setting like this, or maybe in a round sort of theater. On your right, in your upper left, you're looking at a statue base of a distinguished person from a small town called Iotape, and I have the Greek text that's inscribed right on the face of that block right there, where you can see it had to be restored. The council and the people dedicate to this guy, Kendis. They honor him because he was a decaproton. He was a im- imperial priest. He was the Ironarch. He did all these duties, and therefore they allowed his son to put up a statuette of him in the main part of town, visible to everybody at his own expense. But this is the weird thing. It conjures up um, George Bush Sr.'s comment about 1,000 points of light, that in the Roman world, people step forward to do philanthropy and put up statues of themselves downtown at their own expense as a way of demonstrating that they were members of the elite. And ergo, if you don't have a statue there, You are not a member of the elite. It helps separate them in status to have their statue. And they were satisfied with this in lieu of other sort of maybe opportunities that we think of today. So what do we see? We see the Sebastion, the imperial cult center bearing statues of Roman emperors. This was the focal point of expression of loyalty to Roman authority, and hence a active participation in the oikumene. What you see on the right is my survey came up in the brush at the city of Alamos. We realized these two blocks had statue settings for statues on top, and when we put our hand underneath, we could feel the lettering, and so we got a big crowbar, and we tipped the darn thing over, and it turned out it seems to be a statue dedicated, we think, to Hadrian. All points to Hadrian. And in the early empire, let's say to the end of the second century AD, what we see is that there was an enthusiastic participation by the elites at the local level to improve the status of their towns and their families, to enhance their status, to become visible to the elites so that they could expect social mobility. And this is what goes on at this level. Need to climb up in that. And it led itself in rivalry in public building. We talked about Panagia Magna at Pergame, how she started building this water trough partly to draw business away from neighboring towns that were no more, big cities that were no more than 15 miles away. So how are you going to compete? You figure out these ways. In the process, we see an increasing homogeneity of civic institutions. All cities have a council. All cities, from Spain to Syria, have a theater. They'll have a stadium. They will have an amphitheater. They will have a gymnasium. They will have a bath. These features were visible in most settlements, and it was sort of an indication of whether you were a major league city or not. And think of the expense that we go to put up all these sports stadia in cities in America, such as Indianapolis, just to demonstrate that we are a major league city in that regard. The draw and the benefits of the tourism, the hotels, the restaurants, all the things that happen when you create the infrastructure to attract this. And so we'll talk about this in a later lecture, but prosperity, the Pax Romana, the elimination of the extortion of the Republican tax contractors that led to the possibility of reaping profit from investments, stimulated through increased productivity and material prosperity. Prosperity in the Roman world attained a level that would not be achieved again for 1500 years. So, summarizing, we need to make some points here. A tribute, the taxes to Rome, was collected by the decuriones at the local level. The police work was conducted by local ironarchs and gymnasiarchs, and the imperial ruler cult was centered in Sebastia. This is sort of template pattern throughout the Roman Empire. Local amenities included these festivals, which would include feeding the poor at your own expense, let's face it, as well as entertainment. These were funded by wealthy individuals who typically were rewarded with the honor of erecting their statues in the town center at their own expense. This designated them as the elite and everybody else as commoners. The Roman hierarchy was exempt from these duties, these munera. So it was useful to work your way through it to obtain Roman status in order to evade having to expend cost down the road this way. You get noticed by the hierarchy, you get promoted into the hierarchy, and then you can start to pay it back in this way. And senatorial rank became a possibility through your participation locally, if not in your generation, then perhaps. But here's the trick to all this. When you have long periods of stability, there is a tendency that those who control the assets, the decurial class, continue to acquire more and more wealth simply through interest rates, sustained over periods, long periods of time. Increasingly, what we see is land became owned by magnates and tenant farmers, sharecroppers, day laborers worked the land for them. And so we see a bifurcation between landed class, the decurial class, and the landless poor. This ultimately became distinguished in the late empire as the honestiores, the best people, the honorable people, and the humiliores, the poor, the destitute. Um, During the military emergency of the late empire, 235 to 476 AD, everyone of any status is going to become locked into place, and their children were expected to perform the same task. In this era, munera, euergetism, benefaction, became transformed from gifts into taxes. Counselors were expected to make up shortfalls in the tax levies from their own resources. Of course, they did that in the Roman era, but those were the prosperous times. In the emergency, it became really costly, and wealthy people began to evade the burden by seeking exempt status in the Roman hierarchy or the church.